رحم الله من قرأ سورة مباركة الفاتحة. بسم الله. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين خاتم النبيين رحمة للعالمين بالقاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين. أما بعد، فقد قال الله سبحانه وتعالى في كتابه المجيد وقوله الحق. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون. صلوا على محمد وآله. السلام عليكم جميعا ورحمة الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. That's a bit better. It's a great honor and a pleasure to be here in front of you, and I would like to thank the oil management and the board to placing this confidence and trust in me to undertake this enormous responsibility. Believe me, people never quite realize the responsibilities involved in reciting the majalis of Imam Hussein, especially during Muharram. It's a very honorable task, but it's also an overwhelming task to prepare, because you feel the burden that somehow that the Imam has chosen us, the speakers, to deliver his message to the people. So as I say, I would like to thank the board for placing the confidence in me. The title, as you can see, is a spiritual quest or an institutionalized religion. Institutionalization means a group or a body with a set of rules, with a set of dogmas, with a set of, in the case of religion, a church, people who exercise authority on behalf of the church. And that's what we want to explore. Is Islam really an institutionalized religion, or is it a spiritual quest? And I don't want to give you the answer now, because if I do, then somehow I will spoil the fun. I think the answer will come through as we go along. But whenever we talk of an institution, or even a spiritual quest, the question of authority inevitably comes in. And that's something that we will address also. In Islam, where does the authority lie, and with whom? How is it divested? Is it only with God, with the Prophet and the Imams? Or is the authority lay in the text, in the scripture, in the Quran and Hadith? What about during the ghaibah of the Imam? And what kind of authority? So all these questions are issues that we will be discussing. And even when we talk of a spiritualized quest or spiritual quest, where does the authority lie? Because there is such a thing as a spiritual authority in Islam also. So authority is not only in religion, it's also in a spiritual quest. We'll be answering this question, inshallah, as we go along. One thing that I was told is to switch it on, which might help, I think. We want to start with the question of what is Islam to start with. There are 4 steps towards the meaningful experience of the divine. The first is Islam, which is the act of submission to the will of Allah. The second would be Iman, the personal engagement with the divine. The third is Ihsan, which is doing the beautiful deeds. And the fourth one, as you can see, is Ikhlas. Ikhlas comes from the word or the root khalasa, means pure, that which is not mixed with anything. When we talk in our language, we refer to somebody who's sincere. In other words, he or she is completely sincere without being mixed with anything else. In this instance, Ikhlas means not only does Allah see what we do, but He also knows what we think. The purity of our action is connected with the purity of the mind. And therefore the Prophet ﷺ says, اللهم صل على اتقوا فراسة المؤمن فإنه ينظر بنور الله. Be aware of how a true mu'min sees, because a mu'min sees with the light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, he or she goes beyond just the outer. There is a connection between the outer and the inner, something that we will be discussing more and more. What does Islam mean then? Islam, the way that I understand it, is not a noun, not an institutionalized religion, the way it is used in the Quran. One thing that we have to differentiate is how the Quran uses a certain term or certain notions and how we use it today. Because ideas, words, verbs undergo change with time. In the Quran then, Islam is what is called a masdar in Arabic. Masdar means a verbal noun. Dr. Kimji and myself were discussing only a couple of hours ago the ing at the end of a word. Ing means I am in the process of doing something. That's a verbal noun. So for example, food is a noun, eating is a verbal noun, the act of doing something, the act of lecturing, the act of speaking, and so on. So consequently then, Islam in the Quran is not a noun. It's not a name of an act. It's a name of an act, not of that of an institution. In other words, it's an active and dynamic concept. In Islam, in the Quran, that Islam is a masdar, an act of doing something. It's as if the Quran is using the word Islaming. In other words, the act of submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Islam then is not a name of a religion as much as a personal response to the will of the divine. And we see that Islam is used in different ways in the Quran. Islam in the Quran is not something that you talk about, but something that you engage yourself in. It's a submission to the will of God, and is an existential submission. In other words, something that covers your entire existence. Something that shows your devotion to the divine. You do not think beyond Allah. Islam means not only to worship one God, but also more importantly, to refuse to be contained by anything or anybody else but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sallu ala Muhammad wa alihi. This act of submission to the divine is the very first step in the Quran. Iman comes after Islam. You'll remember the very famous verse in the Quran in Surah number 49. Qalatul Arabu amanna. The Arabs said, we have faith, or we are doing faith. And the Quran refused them. Do not say you have faith, you say aslamna. You are submitted. In other words, there is a distinction between Islam and Iman. Submission and engagement with the divine. Interestingly, in the Quran, Islam gets less attention than in Iman does. In other words, there's more focus on Iman. Islam occurs 8 times in the Quran, whereas 45 times, 5 times more than Islam in the Quran. Importantly, the word Iman, which we shall translate as faith, comes from the bab or the word if'al in Arabic. Without going into the linguistics, there are various forms in Arabic. Form 4 is what we call an active, transitive verb. It's something that you are engaged with, and you receive, and you give at the same time. Iman, therefore, is not passive. And therefore, we find that in the Quran, faith is not static at all. It is nourished, and it is nurtured. It can go up, and it can go down also. In fact, in Arabic, as I've said before, and this sounds very awkward in English, you never say, I have faith in God, like we say in English. The word li iman or indi iman does not occur at all. Literally, when you say amantu billahi or u'minu billahi, you are saying, I'm doing faith in God. It sounds very awkward in English to do faith. But that's what we say in Arabic. I am doing faith in God. We do not observe religion, neither do we do faith. As I say, neither do we have faith, we do faith. Similarly, because it is such a dynamic concept, faith does not depend on where you are. Faith depends on who you are. You can be in Mecca and be the perfect kafir, and you can be in Timbuktu or Toronto for that matter and be the best Muslim. In other words, faith is not tied to the land. It is tied to the person, to the character of a person. We should also note very briefly, there is a distinction between faith and belief. We often confuse the two. Many a time we say we have belief, whereas we do not have belief. Or we have faith, we do not have faith. Belief is more connected with having certain ideas, whereas faith is an engagement with the divine. It is quite possible for a person to have belief without doing faith. In other words, a person can join the rank of Islam, of Muslims, but yet not be engaged with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you see what I mean. Sallu ala Muhammad wa alayhi. In our own fold, I find that we pay more importance in what we believe than what we have faith in. We are taught in the madrasa what to believe, usul ad-din this and furu ad-din that. These are matters of belief. But we are never ever taught how to engage with the divine, how to do faith. Faith then is dependent on a person, not on a religion. And therefore we find that people can have the same religion, but not the same faith. People have same religion, but different faith in different people. The distinction between belief and faith is important, because whereas belief urges us to accept certain things, you accept God, you accept the Prophet, faith urges us to connect rather than accept something. And as I said, faith is very dynamic, practical. Interestingly, of the 5 pillars in Islam, 4 of them are connected with practice. Only one of them, Shahada, is actually connected with belief. I believe in one God, I believe in the Prophet, etc. The others are all connected with some kind of practice. Hence, faith is almost invariably mentioned with practice in Islam. Alladhina amanu wa amilu salihat. Those who believe and do good deeds. Monotheism then, the belief in one God, is not only a doctrine. In other words, it's not only a matter of belief. When we say one God, it's not only we believe in one God, but it's also a moral command. In other words, you do something with what you believe. You engage with the divine. You do faith. Not only are we supposed to submit to one, but we are supposed to dedicate our whole life to the one. Sallu ala Muhammad wa The Quran has no word for belief in the modern sense. Indeed, kafir in the Quran is often used differently from how we understand the word kafir. We understand kafir as somebody who does not believe. And yet in the Quran, kufr means somebody who rejects, who is ungrateful, not necessarily one who does not believe. And therefore we find that Iblis in the Quran, وَكَانَ مِنَ الْكَافِرِينَ, that he was amongst those who was a kafir. How can Iblis be a kafir? After all, he did believe in God. His problem was not with Allah. His problem was with Adam. The fact that he's called a kafir shows that in the Quran, kafir does not mean somebody who does not believe. He was a kafir because he was ungrateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Similarly, when Musa alayhi salam goes to Fir'aun, and Fir'aun says, we did what we did to you. We brought you up in our house. وَفَعَلْتَ مَا فَعَلَتَكَ, says, you do what you want to do. فَعَلْتَ وَأَنْتَ مِنَ الْكَافِرِينَ. Fir'aun is telling Musa, you are a kafir. Not because Musa did not believe in God, but because he was ungrateful, according to Fir'aun. That I brought you up in my house, and now you dare oppose me? You truly are ungrateful. So kufr then is conscious, deliberate, active turning away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. These are the characteristics of a kafir. I find that our allegiance is more to Islam than to God. We end up talking more about Islam than our service to God. Haven't you found that? We talk more about Islam is this, Islam is that, than actually about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Let us not forget that Islam is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. In other words, Islam, that act of submission, should lead us to higher things. But we talk more about Islam than Allah. What we do find, interestingly, around the time of Ibn Taymiyyah, that the concept of Islam changes completely. In other words, we hear for the first time the word fil Islam occurring. The word fil Islam in Islam does not occur in the Quran. For the simple reason, the Quran uses Islam as a masdar, as an act. Just as you cannot say in eating, in teaching, in Islamic, it does not make sense. And therefore, fil Islam does not occur in the Quran. Today, we use the word women in Islam, Hajj in Islam, economics in Islam, because our understanding of the word Islam is very different from the way that the Quran uses it. Because if you can say in Islam, then you can also say out of Islam. And that's why we need to understand very briefly the concept of takfir. Takfir, simply put, means to consider somebody an infidel, a non-believer. And it could not occur in the early period simply because there was no concept of in Islam and out of Islam. Although the Kharijites did use it, because they considered themselves as Ahlul Jannah, people of Jannah, and everybody else who did not believe in them was people of hell. Takfir, the idea of declaring somebody a kafir, is a powerful way to eliminate opposition. Anybody who does not agree with you is a kafir. That is, we do takfir to them, God forbid. In other words, it's also used as a way of forcing compliance, that somebody has to obey you. Because if they do not obey you, they're going to go to hell. And if they're going to go to hell, we can do them a big favor and send them there faster. That's the way that the fundamentalists think. So takfir then is a vehicle, a way of religious domination, and yes, religious dictatorship too. Because dictatorship can take different forms, even in the name of religion. Sallu ala Muhammad wa I find, with all due respect, that many a time, instead of us as human beings becoming God-like, we have made God human-like. We have brought God down to our level, rather than us trying to activate the attributes that Allah has put within us. For us to become God-like, we cannot become God. When we say God-like, meaning to activate the attributes, the lovely attribute that He has put within us, we have put God down to our level. We find also that later on with time, Islam becomes not a name of a religion, but that of a culture or of a community. We find, for example, titles like Mulukul Islam, that Islamic sovereignties, Tarikhul Islam, the history of Islam. Well, in this sense then, Islam is mixed up with the name of Muslims. Because in essence, Islam does not have a history. Just as eating does not have a history, sleeping does not have a history, but what we are talking of when we talk of Tarikhul Islam is the history of the Muslim people. How Muslims experienced and expressed themselves in history. So we talk of Mulukul Islam is Muslim kings, not Islamic kings, or the history of the Muslim people. Islamic history is actually a story of the Muslims and how they lived out their faith. Because Islam, as I said, does not have a history itself. The history of the Muslim people refers to the people of a particular culture, of a particular community. And history, does history have a religion in itself? History is history. is the idea of the story of people. And by the way, if we have history, we can also have her story too. Because if you dissect the word his story, is story of him. Or how about her? Because history is also her story. History itself does not have a religion. We have made history Islamic, if you know what I mean. By saying Islamic history, what we are doing is making history Islamic, not making Islam historical. In essence, history has no religion. We have called it Islamic history because of our connection to Islam. Islam, as I said, does not have a history. Muslim do. We have a history. And see now how the meaning of Islam has changed. Islam here is not what God asks from the people, but what we have chosen to give to Him. Islam becomes a system of patterns, of do's and don't do's. We have moved away slowly from the submission to God to a history of the Muslim people. A history, many a time, which is mixed with myths, illogical superstitions. Many, as we shall see, especially in Sufi Islam, a lot of superstitions, a lot of ideas, cultural, which came to be Islam. One of the points that I will emphasize later on, but something that I want us to ponder on at the moment, is that for something to become Islamic, it did not have to arise from the scripture. It did not have to come from the Prophet or from the Quran. Things which were cultural, things which were completely out of the fold of Islam, with our interaction with that culture, became Islamic. Think of the dome, for example. The dome on top of a mosque. It was not there at the time of the Prophet. There's no such word as Qubba in the Quran, but we call it an Islamic dome. Think of the pillar or the minaret. There were no minarets at the time of the Prophet. The domes probably came in at the time of the Turks. The minarets a bit earlier. But they were incorporated in the fold of Islam because of our interaction with them. Do you understand? Similarly, the word ijaza or hilal, the Muslim symbol. Hilal was never ever used as an Islamic symbol at the beginning of Islam. It came much later on. Today we cannot even think of a mosque without a hilal in it, right? Something that was purely non-Islamic became Islamic. What this tells me is that some non-Islamic does not necessarily mean un-Islamic. And as we shall see later on, many of our laws came from pre-Islamic Arabia. So similarly, pre-Islamic does not mean un-Islamic. Non-Islamic does not mean un-Islamic. Sallallahu alaihi Muhammad. So we have moved then from this submission to on God to a history of the Muslim people, which we choose to call Islamic history. And because of that, we find many a time different Muslim groups competing on the right form of Islam. Who is the right form of Islam? We find different Muslims competing that they are the right Islam. And hence we get the term Islamic. We all use it, I use it, you use it. But interestingly, the word Islamic is a relatively new phenomenon. It was not there before, simply put. It makes everything religious, whereas it is not. So, for example, we call so many things Islamic. Islamic food, as if food has got a religion, you know. And haven't you heard the term Islamic terrorists? So even terrorists have a religion now. And of course, Islamic bombs. When India built a bomb, it was never called a Hindu bomb, was it? But when Muslims of Pakistan did it, even the bomb became Islamic itself. Islamic radicals, Islamic food. When we use the term Islamic, and as I say, we all do it, what we are doing is masking cultural and social differences within a community. Somehow everything becomes one, somehow everything becomes Muslim. We neglect to understand that there are differences within the Muslim community. And we have, as I said, used such terms to make it a monolith. In other words, Muslims are one community. It masks the differences within the Muslim community, and even cultural, something which is cultural becomes religion. Let me ask you this: the burqa, chador, abaya, bui, are they Islamic dresses? They are all cultural dresses. Burqa is Afghani. If it was an Islamic, then all of the ladies here would be wearing burqa too, right? If, for example, abaya was an Islamic dress, then the women would be wearing abaya, and so on. Hijab is an Islamic dress, if you like. Burqa or abaya are all cultural manifestations. In other words, how people choose to dress themselves. But today we say this is an Islamic dress or Islamic food. We need to be careful then how we use the word Islam. Because if we are not, then many a time we find Islam fighting Islam. The next point that I think we need to be aware of, and we frequently use it without being aware of what it means, the concept of orthodoxy. We say often, I'm an orthodoxy. What do we mean by orthodox? We tend to understand orthodox is somebody who is kind of a singular way, narrow view, is either my way or the highway kind of thing, right? Not the kind of person you want your daughter to marry. That's our understanding. But actually, orthodox was a very positive term. Orthodox means the right way, originally. So people wanted to be that right way. The problem with the Islamic context is this. We do not have, as we shall see later on, a church. We do not have a priesthood. We do not have clergyhood. The scholars, Maraji, etc., are not clergies. They are scholars who interpret the texts. It is Christianity which has clergyhood, because they are a special class, ordained. The priests, especially in the Catholic Church, are seen as a mediator between the human and the divine. Therefore, you go to a local priest to confess in Catholicism. I hope you do not go to your local resident alim or your local marja to confess, because these terms do not exist in Islam. And therefore, this concept of orthodoxy is alien to Islam. What we do have is orthopraxy, meaning the right way of doing things. Because we do not have a definition of group who can actually take you out of Islam. You take yourself out of Islam by declaring yourself a non-Muslim. But nobody can, in the right mind, tell you that you are out of Islam. Because we do not have that system of excommunication. On the contrary, as I said, we have orthopraxy, the right practices as defined by the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet. Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. There is no single version that all Muslims are agreed upon. What Islam says, because many a time people ask, what does Islam say on this? What does Islam say on that? To me, that's a problematic issue. For the simple reason is what Islam says depends on who you ask. Even within Shia Islam, many a time you ask something and they tell you, the answer is, Kinu taqleed kare ho? Whose taqleed are you doing? Am I right or wrong? Simply because their answer depends on whose taqleed you are doing, whose interpretation of Islam you are following. There is no single version of Islam that all Muslims are agreed upon. Yes, we do agree in one Allah, we do agree in the Prophet, but we cannot even agree on the moon. We cannot agree on most things in Islam. In other words, what Islam says depends on who you ask. Because there is no priesthood that can define correct beliefs or correct practices. And therefore you will find that in the early period, even our own ulama, scholars, regarding beliefs differed amongst themselves on many, many issues. The question of the nature of the knowledge of the imam. How much does an imam know, for example? This is one of our beliefs. Does he know everything? Where is the line of how much he knows and how much he doesn't know? There were differences between the scholars also on this, on many of our basic issues. Within Muslim community, for example, in the 10th, 11th century, there was a big debate, can you believe it? Whether the Quran, which all Muslims read, is that the created word of God or uncreated? Muslims have got nothing better to do than think about whether it's created or uncreated. To the extent that during the time of Al-Ma'mun, the Abbasid Caliph, we're talking of the time of Imam Rada here, there was a big mihna or inquisition in the Muslim community, whereby people in the streets were caught and asked, do you believe the Quran was created or not created? Most people could say, who cares? I believe in the Quran. Whether it was created or not created, really it doesn't matter to me. This is what people would say. But you could be punished, you could be imprisoned if you believe during the time of Ma'mun that the Quran was uncreated. Because he believed that the Quran was created. And this was a big school in Islam. All I'm trying to show is the divergence and differences within the Muslim community itself on most, whether it is theology or matters of practice and so on. Today, in the Muslim community, the Ahlul Sunnah have 4 schools of law, right? Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi, and Hanbali. At one time, they had 10 schools of law. Sheikh Al-Tusi, who's one of our greatest scholars, says that the differences within the Shia community is more than all the Sunni schools put together. He says it in his Umdatul Usul. Now, I'm not trying to make a mockery out of it. I'm trying to prove a point that there is no priesthood that can define correct belief. And indeed, the catchword, the P word, the Muslim P word, pluralism, has always been a feature of Islam. In fact, in Islam, there is no priesthood. Because of that, anybody can do anything. You do not, I repeat, you do not require an alim for any function. You'd be surprised the number of times our young girls have approached me and said, Dr. Takim, we are fed up to see the 2 Maulanas marrying each other week in, week out in the mosque during the wedding season. And the same Maulanas are marrying each other. He said, because you do not need an alim to perform a wedding, by the way. And I'm going to say something which is controversial, but it is correct. A woman is allowed to recite her own nikah. You are aware of that, right? So, Sallu ala Muhammad wa and if you want proof of that, all you do is just open Tawdihul Masail of the marja that you are following, and he will say that a woman performs her nikah by saying, Andahtuka nafsi ala al-mahr al-ma'lum, and he replies, Qabiltu. That's simple. It's that simple. So you do not need an alim for anything. You do not need an alim to lead you in prayers, by the way. As long as you know how to lead prayers, how to recite with proper makhraj, you can lead prayers. If you are a man and woman, they can lead women, but we won't go into whether a woman can lead men in prayers, because that's a different issue. And some Maharaja do believe, by the way, that a woman can lead men in prayers, but that's a different issue. So we do not need alim because there is no priesthood in Islam. Technically, although this might be a bit difficult, you could even perform your own funeral, although that might be difficult. But anybody can perform. So, anybody can do anything in Islam. We do not require an alim. Scholars are interpreters, not priests in Islam. The concept of institutionalized Islam is an issue that we will deal with even more later on. But in brief, an institution is a kind of a church, although we do not have the same concept in Islam, which demands obedience and compliance, which has a set of beliefs, a priesthood, if you like, and a way of running things, an authority that can demand something from you. And if you do not comply, then you are out of that community. We do not have such a system in Islam, although some would say that we have created one. The problem with institutions is this: they want sameness, not otherness. It's robotic, monolithic, and very frequently intolerant of differences. Sounds familiar? It is. In fact, if you have followed the Protestant movement in Christianity, we're talking of Christianity now, the imposition of authority of interpreters was something that Martin Luther protested. Luther, and hence the Lutheran Church, in the 16th century, he was not against the Bible. He was not against Christianity. He was against two things: the abuse of the church and the Pope himself. In fact, he took the Bible in front of the Pope and says, show me where are you in this Bible. Because the idea of the papacy only comes in the 3rd, 4th century in Christianity. That goes to show that institutions themselves can be suffocating. I'm not saying that all institutions are, but certainly Luther thought so. You know what Luther did? Something that we might even consider doing. That he said to his students that I want you to take the Bible and I want you to ignore all the interpretations before it. Because the Bible is sacred in his eyes, but not the interpreter. We'll come to the same theme later on when we talk of the Quran and its interpretation also. In an institution, then, the autonomous agent, a person, is negated simply because of the need for compliance within the community. Sallu ala Muhammad wa alayhi. You've been a patient crowd, and I'm almost at the end of today's majlis as far as this part is concerned. But in brief then, we need to draw a distinction between the historical and the Quranic Islam. Because as we saw, even the word Islam itself, from how it was used in the Quran as a very active, dynamic concept, whereby a person does faith with God, has now been reduced to almost an institution which demands compliance, in which people can be brought into Islam and excommunicated or thrown out of Islam by some other groups, especially the fundamentalist groups. We need to draw a distinction between the historical and the Quranic. Historical Islam is one many a time whereby Muslims, through their history, they have negated the role of women. They have subdued women to a very passive role in Islam, one that demands compliance rather than reasoning. The Quranic Islam is an Islam of justice, whereas we find that historical Islam often asks people to remain oppressed. The Quranic Islam is an Islam for the respect of women, emphasis on education and so on. The Quran emphasizes reasoning, whereas unfortunately, through time, Muslims have emphasized blind imitation. Imitation is important, yes, because we do imitate those who are our mentors, but blind imitation is something else, whereby we blindly imitate people without even thinking, even if they do not make sense many a time. This is what the Quran is totally against, because the Quran asks us continuously. Not only does it ask us to think, but it asks us that you follow people blindly, even though they were wrong, and lead you to their way of thinking without you even questioning them. Allah will not, and I repeat, will not give us a device and then tell us not to use it. If Allah gave us aql, it was for a reason, so to speak. He gave us reason for a reason, which is to use that reason, not to negate that reason. Sallu ala Muhammad wa Sallallahu alayka ya Aba Abdullah. Sallallahu alayka ya ibn Rasulillah. Ruhi wa jismi wa arwahul alameen laka al-fida. Ya madlum, ya gharib, ya shahida bi ardi Karbala. One of the questions that we are asked often is the issue of the ziyarah, of visiting the graves. Indeed, historically we find that the Prophet himself would often visit the graves of those who were buried at Uhud. Not only that, he would visit Baqi very often. And when he was asked, I'm talking from Sunni sources now, not only Shia sources. When the Prophet was asked, he says, visit the grave because they will remind you of the hereafter. We tend to focus so much on this world. It is only when we go and visit the cemetery that we realize that one day this will be our homes. The Prophet himself would also visit the grave of his mother. Not only would he, Abu Hurairah is saying this, Not only would the Prophet visit the grave of his mother, he would weep and he would make others weep at that time. He would go to Baqi at night and recite the salams, the greetings on the Ahlul Qubur, as I said, the people of the grave. Imam Zain al-Abidin alayhi salam used to go from Medina after the events of Karbala. He would go from Medina to Kufa. There's a report that somebody asked him, because after all Imam Zain al-Abidin was not living in Kufa. He was asked, Ya Ibn Rasulullah, what are you doing in this mosque of Kufa? You live in Medina. He says, I came to Karbala first of all. You know, it's quite far from Karbala to Kufa, in those days especially. He says, I came to Karbala, I went to Karbala to do the ziyarah of my father. And then I came to pray in the mosque of my father also, in Kufa itself. We also are aware, this idea of ziyarah is not a Shia concoction. On the contrary, it was something that right from the beginning. You will recall, historically, it is very well documented, that when Hazrat Zainab went back from Medina, from Damascus, going towards Medina, she stopped in Karbala first. And who was doing the ziyarah at that time when she came? Jabir ibn Abdullah al-Ansari. Jabir, a foremost, a very prominent companion of the Prophet himself. My sisters and brothers in Islam, go for the ziyarah as much as you can. We find that historically, people went through enormous difficulties just to go and do the ziyarah. The son of Abu Hamza al-Thumali says, his name was Hussein bin Abu Hamza al-Thumali, says, I used to go to Karbala in the middle of the night for fear of being caught. People had to undertake enormous difficulties and possible threats, imprisonment, and even death, just to go and do the ziyarah of Imam Hussein. Indeed, Karbala, as we know it now, was often surrounded by the Umayyad forces. So people could not go to do the ziyarah. During the time of Al-Mutawakkil, the Abbasid Caliph, he completely destroyed the grave of Imam Hussein. But of course the people knew, you can destroy the physical remnants, but not the spiritual one. The people knew exactly where Imam Hussein was buried. The question of ziyarat became more popular during the time of the Buyid period, in the 11th and 12th centuries, because that's when a more favorable empire or dynasty came into power. So important was this ziyarah of Karbala that we find a person like Dailami, who lived in the 5th century of Islam. He came to Karbala, and you know what he did? He took some soil from Karbala and brought it back to his hometown. He said, this is for those people who cannot go to Karbala. If you cannot go to Karbala, Karbala will come to you. Just have a little bit of that khaka shifa, as we call it, in order to taste the purity of that land in which Hussein used to live. People ask us about this whole idea of majlises and crying for Imam Hussein. Historically, we know, not only did Hazrat Zainab cry for Imam Hussein, right there in Karbala, in Kufa, in Sham where she held majalis, but even during the times of the Imams lived under severe oppression, not only during the time of the Banu Umayyah, but even during the time of Banu Abbasid. You know what the Imams would do? They would gather poets and a few of the close companions in their houses. And the majalis was often in the form of poetry for Imam Hussein. So for example, Abu Harun al-Makfuf was a very famous poet. He would recite about Imam Hussein to Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq. And whenever he would recite, the Imam would say, recite more, I want to hear about my grandfather. Kumayt, not Kumayl, Kumayt bin Zayd al-Asadi was another poet who came during the time of Imam al-Baqir. And when he would recite, the Imam would be moved by his poetry. The Imam would say, oh, Kumayt, you are supported by Ruh al-Qudus, by the Holy Spirit. When Kumayt reached this particular point, something that we hardly ever recite, that even before the battle started, the enemies would fire arrows at the camp of Imam Hussein. Sometimes they will attach little notes saying that you will never ever taste any water, just to torment them even more, traumatize them even more. They would send notes to the camp of Imam Hussein saying you will not taste any water. At that time, when Kumayt would reach this particular point, the Imam al-Baqir, he would raise up his hand and says, Ya Allah, forgive Kumayt and grant him his wishes. Many a time we find that poets would recite this even though they were in great danger. Many a time we find that Harun al-Rashid, for example, he cut off the tongue of one poet, Mansur al-Numayr, because of his love and his poetry of Imam Hussein. Azadarana Hussein will talk more and more about Imam Hussein and about his epic journey and the events in Karbala. But in the month of Rajab, in the year 679, around the 26th Rajab, Imam Hussein was sitting in the mosque in the middle of the night with Abdullah ibn Zubair. Suddenly, a young boy called Abdullah comes to him. Says, Walid bin Utbah is calling you. Walid is calling you. Walid, the governor of Muawiyah, now Yazid in Medina. Imam Hussein asks Abdullah, what is happening, do you know? Abdullah says, I do not know. Imam Hussein tells Abdullah, Muawiyah is dead, and they are going to ask us for submission to Yazid. At that point, Imam Hussein goes to his own people. He asks Abbas and a few other youths, Ali Akbar and others, come with me and wait at the door of Walid. If you see my voice is raised, come in, because I'll be in great danger. Hussein enters the house of Walid. Marwan bin Hakam is with Walid at that time. Marwan had already told Walid that ask Hussein for bay'ah. And if he does not give you bay'ah, then kill him right away. Because if you do not get bay'ah tonight, you'll never get the bay'ah of Hussein. Hussein enters the house of Walid. Walid gives him the note from Yazid, saying that Muawiyah is dead, and that Hussein should give bay'ah to Yazid. You know what Imam Hussein says? There are two reports. In one report, he's reported to have said, Mithli la yubayu sirran. Those like me do not give bay'ah in privacy, in secrecy. If you want bay'ah, do it in public. But there is another report, a very profound report, in which Imam Hussein says, Mithli la yubayu or mithla. Those like me will never give bay'ah to those like him. Because there is a difference not only between Hussein and Yazid, but also between truth and falsehood. Those like me will not give bay'ah to those like him. Marwan stands up and says, Oh Walid, get the bay'ah from him now. Because if you do not, then you will never get the bay'ah. If he does not give the bay'ah, kill him right now. At that time, Imam Hussein got angry to Marwan. Says, Marwan, you think you can threaten me? You think I'm scared of you? Hussein left. Marwan says to Walid, I told you to get bay'ah from him. Walid says, Oh Marwan, you do not know what you're asking of me. You want me to kill Hussein and to forsake my akhirah? Wallahi, if everything in the world was given to me on the one hand, and the head of Hussein on the other, I would rather forsake the world, but I would never ever kill Hussein ibn Ali. This was Walid, supposedly a governor of Yazid. Hussein knows that now he's no longer safe in Medina. He asked his women folk and the others within the family that we need to leave Medina right tonight, because tomorrow they will ask me for bay'ah in public, and I do not want to give bay'ah to Yazid. Our reports say that Hussein, before he left Medina, he went to the qabr of his grandfather, and he lay on the qabr and he started crying. Ya Jaddah, oh my grandfather, they are asking me to give bay'ah to Yazid. If I do bay'ah to Yazid, I will be doing kufr. But if I do not, then I will be killed. I do not wish to leave the precincts of your grave, but I have no choice today. In the middle of the night, Hussein leaves Medina and goes towards Mecca. We'll recite more about Mecca tomorrow. But this much I will say, that as Hussein was about to go towards Kufa, he was on the way towards Kufa, he sends a messenger of his called Qais bin Musahar al-Saydawi. Qais has got a letter from Hussein to the people of Kufa. As Qais gets close to Kufa, Kufa is surrounded by Ibn Ziyad now. Qais is caught. You know what the first thing that Qais does? He takes out that letter of Hussein and he tears it apart, because he does not want these Kufans to read the letter of Hussein. Qais is brought in front of Ibn Ziyad. Ibn Ziyad says, who are you? He says, I'm Qais bin Mustahar al-Saydawi. What are you doing here? He says, I'm carrying the message of Hussein to the people of Kufa. Ibn Ziyad says to Qais, what is that message? Qais says, I will not tell you. Ibn Ziyad says, you have two choices now. Either you go and curse Hussein on the minbar, or I will kill you. Qais knew he had to deliver a message to the people of Kufa. Look at how faithful Qais was. He goes on the minbar, he says, I will curse Hussein. But instead of cursing Hussein, Qais goes and sends the salutations on the Prophet. He praises Allah, and then he says, oh people of Kufa, I'm Qais, the messenger of Hussein. I have brought the message to you that Hussein is coming to you. Do not leave him alone. Do not leave him alone. Do not dissociate yourself from him. And yes, O people of Kufa, may God curse Yazid and Muawiyah and Abu Sufyan. At that point, Qais was taken to the top of the palace. His body was thrown from the palace to the streets of Kufa. At one point, when Hussein sees people coming from the Kufa, he asks them, O people of Kufa, did Qais, my messenger, come to you? They said, yes, Qais came to us. What happened to him? The people described to Hussein what Qais did and what happened to him. That his body was dragged in the streets of Kufa. Hussein says, amongst the people are those who are truthful to their faith. There are those who have given their lives. There are those who are waiting to give their lives. But they have not changed even a little bit. ألا لعنة الله على القوم الظالمين سيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون إنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون